Sometimes when I morph, I can't help but notice this gigantic explosion right behind me for no apparent reason.
I assume you're referring to the residual energy runoff that is sometimes necessary to clear the suit's biofield channels during the morph.
I'm referring to the 6-story high fireballs, like that one, right there.
You know, adaptation's a funny thing. Whenever you turn one story into another medium, you always drop things, you add things, it's countless. There's one unique form of adaptation that's really hard to define, really hard to find that definitive line. Now everybody knows how Power Rangers is made. Super Sentai gets filmed in Japan for the Japanese public, and basically through licensing and a variety of other purchases and ownership, the rights to the footage is handed over to an American company. From Saban, Disney, and now currently Hasbro, they have access to the footage, the character designs, all this kind of guff and miscellaneous things, and they are allowed to edit the footage in order to make an episode of Power Ranger. Typically that involves removing all the human bits and keeping all the suit bits. They then film out-of-suit stuff in America or New Zealand, whichever's cheaper at the time, and edit it in, making a brand new show. And that's how we have Power Rangers, and have had Power Rangers since 1993. Now, using this process, you start to see some chinks in the armor. Namely, they can't really deviate from the fight scene. In order to get all the action, they gotta keep them intact. So a lot of creativity just needs to be implemented on editing around them. It's fascinating stuff. And when looking at the fact that they have a certain amount of footage, they can't expand on it. Well, they can, but it gets costly, and Power Rangers is a very budget-friendly show to make, so they don't want to spend more money than they do. That's why they stopped continuing like they did with Mighty Morphin and started using the other suits that Super Sentai was creating. It was in order to just make it easier to make the show. Oh god, I burped. That's disgusting. But in adaptation, they added a very weird specific thing to the Power Rangers lore that a lot of fans just kind of take for granted. It's the equivalent of the Force for Power Ranger fans. It's the Morphing Grid. And when you take the Morphing Grid and the already constrained elements of the creation of Power Rangers, you get interesting things like this.
Hold on, I know that Rita had the green power coin first, but what about the other 5 coins?
We have them here. Red, blue, black, yellow, and pink.
You already have the energy from your pink coin. Too much pink energy is dangerous.
So when it comes to the show, what is the Morphing Grid? Commonly, over all the seasons, the Morphing Grid has been kind of a generic catch-all for the energy that the Ranger team accesses in order to gain their power. Where are the suits kept? In the Morphing Grid. Where are our weapons at? In the Morphing Grid. Where do our superpowers come from? Morphing Grid. It's a general catch-all, and it's just an easy write-off for a lot of hand-wavy stuff. Now, not every season brings it up, but when they do, they never really give definitive rules about it. It's just always, oh, the Morphing Grid is doing something. The Morphing Grid is doing that. It's really just a very nebulous thing. It's very much like the cosmic energy of Marvel Comics. It's there, and it can do a lot of different things, but it's up to the author to figure out what they want to do with it. So the Morphing Grid is up to the people who are writing that season to figure out what it does. All in all, it just works. But see, that's the thing. It works, but I have a theory why. Theory may be a strong word. It's probably more just a very strong headcanon, but yeah. So to get this idea of what this headcanon theory thing is, we need to realize that in real life, outside of the fiction of the Power Rangers universe, Super Sentai exists. We know how Power Rangers is created. It exists in a different bubble, completely separate from the Power Rangers universe, and that's where I start to see the similarities. If you think of these two properties not as separate, completely unrelated franchises, and more like an interconnected universe, something akin to like the Marvel universe or the DC multiverse, you start to see the brief ideas of an explanation for the Morphing Grid. Now, in-universe, Super Sentai teams don't usually have a unifying, connecting power source for all their individual powers. It's much more randomized. this team gets it from a universe, this team gets it from toys, this team gets it from this. It's all very individualized to the team. But whenever they transform, the power is expunged, essentially. Think of it as the power is expunged, very much like the pyro that happens behind the transformation in Super Sentai shows. That's excess power, excess energy that happens whenever they transform. So where does that energy go? Well, it goes into the universal bubble of energy stuff. And if that universal bubble of energy stuff is, say, right next to another universe, say a universe where the Power Rangers exist, they may be able to tap into that excess energy. Now this takes several real-world elements and turns it into story element. Why can't there be more than 2 Pink Rangers? Because the original energy that was expunged only had 1 Pink Ranger. How come some teams must give up the fight even though they're still willing to go on and fight harder? Because the energy's depleted. There's no more energy for them to tap into because the Super Sentai doesn't have any more energy. And hell, why limit this to Power Rangers? If you think about it, this may explain why there hasn't been really any Kamen Riders in this universe. Kamen Riders don't expunge as much energy because there's only one of them, thus the energy is more easily dissipated. That's why you could probably wrap your head around the idea that Black RX was able to be adapted, because Black and Black RX amplify the amount of energy that can be tapped into for Masked Rider to tap into the Morphing Grid, and why Kamen Rider Dragon Knight was able to exist because there were more Kamen Riders expunging more energy in a more succinct fashion, very much like a Super Sentai. And ultimately, this headcanon theory thing can add credence to Megaforce. One of the biggest complaints of Megaforce, there has been numerous, shout out and plug to the Vacuuminator and his entire saga, just shitting on Megaforce and just going like, this is shit. Like, link in the description, go check it out, he's a great dude. But one of the biggest complaints was the extra powers came from nowhere. They haven't existed in Power Rangers before, and they were just there. No explanation, none given, none needed, apparently. But, using this headcanon theory concept thing, you can think of them as being able to access little pockets of the Morphing Grid that Power Rangers just never tapped into before. It basically gives a history to powers that never existed in Power Rangers by just using the Super Sentai history itself. Now, I'm going to completely admit, this is a headcanon theory that damn near encroaches on fanfiction. There's nothing wrong with fanfiction. This is just more of a fun explanation for the events that take place in the adaptation process. And you know, as a comic book fan, it just kind of makes me feel a little giddy to think that these two things that I like and love could still be connected in a similar way to like Marvel or DC. Because either way we think about it, these two little worlds are a lot more connected than we think.